for the Arts Festival Summit 2022 in Yerevan, Armenia. Hosted by the Yerevan Perspective International Music Festival. More info on EFA's website.
Welcome back. We are assembled here around small circles, which obviously gives us the task to talk to each other and to listen to each other in 4 sessions that we have prepared for you. 2 blocks this morning and 2 in the afternoon after lunch. So don't be afraid that we are sitting here for 4 hours in a row. No, we have a fantastic lunch planned for you in the after 2 sessions. The idea of these 4 sessions is to reflect on the role of festivals from different perspectives. These perspectives include the perspective of an artist, the perspective of an urban thinker, the cities level, the perspective of a business representative, and the perspective of a young European. The idea here is that we reflect on the role of festivals from these perspectives that are presented through a keynote speaker we invited. This keynote speaker, or this provocation, let's say, aims to start your thinking process. So you will listen first to somebody here in the front. That's why you have to make sure really to be able to see this podium and the 2 screens, because there will be PowerPoint presentations given and shared in these keynote moments. These keynotes will be around 15 minutes, 15 to 20 minutes. And after these 15 to 20 minutes, we will throw questions at you from here to these round circles that you will discuss. And in these round circles, you have 1 or 2 persons that are a little bit more prepared than you to make the word circulate in that circle, but not more than that. So the role or the responsibility of each of you and the joy is to have that conversation really in a free way. After 15 minutes of the first question that we are throwing at you, there will be a little jingle that is played. And I don't know if Audrey can give you the example and condition your brain so that when you listen and hear this jingle, I think the idea here, great, Audrey, thank you, is to have a crescendo. So this jingle will get louder and louder and louder and forbid you basically after 20 seconds to talk and to listen to Tom and to me again for the second question. But I would say, without further ado, let's give it a try. I think round number 1 is giving and setting the standard and setting the example of the 3 rounds to follow. And I'm happy, Tom, that you are here with me to introduce the first round content-wise.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back. It's a huge privilege to introduce our first speaker, who will give the perspective of an artist. And you heard briefly from him earlier, but our first speaker is Shahidul Alam from Bangladesh, who's a photojournalist, a teacher, a social activist, a festival creator, the founder of the Drik Picture Library, the Pathshala South Asian Media Institute in Dhaka, and the Chobi Mela International Photography Festival. And among many awards, was selected as one of the Persons of the Year by Time magazine in 2018. So to bring his perspective and to share his thoughts with you, I'm delighted to welcome Shahidul Alam.
Applause.
Hi. They give you time limits, but you know, I've got the mic and you're a stuck audience. So you don't have much of a choice. But I'll try and elaborate. I mean, the festival that I run, Chobi Mela, was set up in 2000. At that time, there was only one festival in the country run by the government. And the government festival invited friends of ministers or sons of bureaucrats, and it was really a pretty shabby festival, but it had all the funding, that was what it was about, and the primary venues were there. We had another problem, which is photography in a country like Bangladesh was not then considered art. So you had levels of artists. You had the painters who were the Brahmins and the photographers who were the untouchables. So we were resisting from that perspective as well. And one of the issues also was access. In order for me to be here, I've actually traveled 48 hours. Bangladesh does not have an Armenian embassy. I would have had to post my passport to a foreign land, a land that, by the way, considers me persona non grata, in order to be able to get a visa. Eventually, with a lot of working behind the scenes, I managed to get a visa in Athens, allowing me to arrive, along with some of you, in the early hours of the morning. I mention that merely because these are inequalities that many people just do not recognize. Bangladeshis need visas to go to the toilet. And that's pretty much par for the course. You assume that there are no laws preventing people from coming, but the mechanics make it very different. I'll show you a little clip and talk over it as I do, and then try and expand on some of those. Can we have the film? So I'm only showing you one clip. This is from 2018. By then, our festival had become prominent enough for us to decide to invite the president of the country to open the festival, which we did. And it was a question for us. We were largely anti-establishment. And here we were inviting the president to open our festival. But there was a reason for that. It was also a statement that a festival had reached a particular position where it needed to be recognized by the state. There are certain advantages of doing this. Bureaucrats are often lazy, so when you invite the president, apart from the security hassles and whatever, they ask you to write down the president's speech. So you can actually craft that speech. And if you do it skillfully enough, you can actually get them to say things you want them to say without them really realizing what they've committed themselves to. And that quite works. What you can also do is send out the official press release so that their written version is on record on media without them having the gall to question that should they move from that script. So it's the president of Bangladesh beside me. The cafe at the top is also part of that strategy. You know that when the president's there, you're going to get a lot of media presence. So my kafir was my statement for solidarity with the Palestinian movement. So you try all sorts of things.
I wish I could name all the framers, painters, carpenters, electricians, drivers and rickshawallas.
The person next to Ruth Eichhorn is the cultural minister. So you've got the big wigs out there. And they have endorsed this whole thing. Interestingly enough,
the world of photography, we
can have the audio down perhaps. What's very interesting is how the festival began. When we began in the year 2000, we were going to show a major show on the War of Liberation of Bangladesh in the National Museum.
I formally declare Sobi Mela 8 open.
So that's the president of Bangladesh opening our festival. And of course, it's big news and all that sort of thing. But when we had that festival, at 10:30 at night, the night before the opening at the National Museum, the minister rings me up to say, some of those pictures must go. Because it didn't fit the official narrative. They wanted their version of the show. So of course, we pulled the show from the National Museum at 10:30 at night, found a different venue, put it up there, and we had a great show and a great opening with the government with egg on its face having to explain why this show was not at the National Museum where it was designed to be. So they assume that when they do those things, you will back off. But I think we underestimate ourselves. This is what we also do is give out a Lifetime Achievement Award. We have things going around, and you will also see incidentally, now I don't ride a bicycle for security reasons, so that's another part of the story. But this is, in Old Dhaka, we take up unconventional spaces, we turn ordinary buildings into gallery spaces. This no longer exists right now. This is a beautiful old theatre, which we converted. So we've used all those sort of things. We also have the white cube spaces. And that's Larry Towell from Magnum. What was interesting in that case was we wanted support for Larry to come, and the Canadian High Commission was prepared to support it, but insisted that he not talk about Palestine. So we invited him anyway, on our own funds, and he spoke about Palestine every chance he got. But this is very interesting. We have a mobile version of our festival, which goes to school fields, playgrounds, on boats across the river. So if people cannot go to the gallery goes to the people. And that's how we've actually designed the whole thing. We have the rock stars of Bangladesh performing pro bono with us. We go on a boat, we dance all night. It's celebratory as well. And that's also part of it. And I spent this time trying to give you some context, because I see our festival as a form of resistance. In a space which is so largely controlled by the establishment, you have to find ways to resist, and in creative ways. They have money, they have muscle. What they do not have is creativity. And in a sense, what we are fighting is a guerrilla war through art, by finding ways to maneuver through those spaces. And I think those are the skill sets that we have. And I think we underestimate ourselves sometimes. We look to see how difficult it is. We recognize sometimes how futile it is. And there are times when you say, what's the use? We give up. And I think the minute you've said that, the minute you say, what's the use, they have won. They don't need to do anything anymore, because you've done it for them. And that hanging on, that resistance, is perhaps what we're about. Because one of the things I recognize in a country like Bangladesh, and we were just talking about this earlier, in so many of our countries there are repressive regimes with total control sometimes, and they grind you down and they grind you down until it gets to a point where you think, oh, I can't do this anymore. But you need to be able to do that, because you're not alone. Firstly, you're not alone as an individual, but you're also someone who represents the aspirations of very many people out there. And your giving up means the community giving up. So for me, I'll end with a very small anecdote, if you like. I was picked up in 2018, I was tortured, I spent 107 days in jail, but what happened was there was absolutely a global campaign for my release. A dozen Nobel laureates, celebrities across the globe, but more importantly, people on the streets of Bangladesh out there resisting. But what happened immediately afterwards was we lost all our corporate clients. We were just too hot to handle. One CEO actually rang me on the landline to say, sorry, Shahidul, nothing personal, but it's too dangerous for me to answer your phones. Yeah, I showed you on my bicycle. I've been cycling for over 50 years. Today, I do not bicycle because it's too dangerous. I do not use a mobile phone because I get tracked. I never go anywhere on my own because it's too dangerous. Not that the government would necessarily do something, but someone wanting brownie points might do something just because it's expedient to do so. And you don't want to make it easy for your opposition. So I live a very different lifestyle from what I used to. But what we have been able to do is build a space of resistance that simply does not exist or did not exist before. And keeping that alive is very, very important. And I'll say this because, before I was known in professional circles, locally, internationally. Within Bangladesh, the average person did not know me. Why should they? But once I got arrested, once this news was out there, I got known by many people. We also had to leave our premises because they sent a bulldozer to break it down and whatever. So we hired a place much more expensive than we could afford, but that's what we needed to survive. One day I'm leaving the office, and as I'm stepping out of the building, there's a woman with a young baby, obviously waiting for me, and she comes up and says, "Can you bless my child? I want him to grow up to be as brave as you." And that really is very, very powerful when you think that the average person feels that what you do has so much meaning. And that, I think, is the onus that we take on, because we as artists are not simply individuals producing art. We represent the aspiration of many people. And when a vulnerable woman feels that her child should be able to grow up to be brave, when everyone else is staying quiet, I think you have a task that you cannot give up. Thank you.
Shadul, we might speak for a moment before we open it for the group, if that's okay. It's extraordinary to hear about what you're doing. Can you tell us a little bit about the structures that you have around you in terms of the festival that you make, and what the team looks like, and in terms of managing these kind of these very complex contexts and relationships, actually how you go about doing it?
It's a very pertinent question. I mean, I didn't spend time over the video, but we basically defy gravity because we work on very tiny budgets. And the reason we can do it is because there's so much that we do which is done because individuals provide, the framing we do, the printing we do, the curation, obviously, and a whole range of things. It's a community that feels it is their festival. So they come together. So that is there. But we actually were very strategic. We started initially with picture library, the Rick Picture Library, and that was set up in 1989. It was set up not as an NGO, though all our organizations primarily are connected through our need for social justice. We're very much into democracy, governance, human rights, those issues. So when we set up the agency, we didn't set up an NGO, we set up a private limited company. Because NGOs are governed by regulations which we wanted to get out of, but also as a media organization, we wanted to be independent. And that independence has been very, very important for us because we've had a voice that the civil society doesn't often have. Then, if you've got a fight, you need warriors. So we set up a school of photography in '98. And then we needed a way for our work to be international and for international work to come to us. So that's when we set up the festival. So each one helped the other. But with the festival, by the time we had the festival, we've actually got all these students, former students, the artists who work with us, the agency itself. The agency works at the production end. The school works at the education end. Everyone works in terms of gathering this network of volunteers, and that's what allows our festival to stay alive. So what they can't work out is how we can do a festival of such stature with minuscule budgets. But the other advantage of that is when you're not weighed down by a huge budget, you actually have a lot more freedom. It's ironic, but being able to shed yourself, to be lean, allows you to do things. And that's what makes it much more difficult for them to stop us as well. Because we're agile, we slip through the fingers, and they don't know what the hell is going on, how we continue to do what we do with all this weight above us.
Thanks so much. Can I ask you also just about the relationship between the work that you do and the places where it happens? It was interesting to hear about what it's like working in a contested space like the National Gallery, but in terms of like how you find the other beautiful spaces that you work with, the kind of partnerships that you make, and how you, and I suppose how you think about the work in relation to the place.
Okay, beauty boarding, which was being shown there, was actually a motel in Old Town, which used to be traditionally the place where philosophers, writers, poets used to get together. It was, in a sense, like the backstreet cafes of Paris or whatever in the early times. And we wanted to retain that characteristic, that these were the intellectual spaces which we've now lost. So they were very open. They remembered their history and the fact that we were in some way able to relive that legacy that they had. They actually allowed us to take over their motel and turn it into a gallery. One of them is an old dance theatre. Of course, there are open-air spaces. We've also worked with the government. And I mean, while we are critical of the government, we recognize that they are important entities, and we want to use them. We want to turn them around. And in a sense, our job, it is our government. And I think rather than put us in opposition, present ourselves in a strategic way where they actually feel that it is expeditious for them. Because one of the things that happens is, through, say, Chobimela, we've had people like Noam Chomsky, Arundhati Roy, and other people who would never come to Bangladesh on the invitation of the government, but will respond to our requests. So, in a sense, what they also want to do is to be on our slipstreams and celebrate the credibility that we have.
Thanks so much. It's really inspiring to kind of hear, I think, some things which are unique to your context, but also very relevant to so many of us who are working in festivals in terms of how we think about the relationship with place, and also this kind of trying to do things which are impossible. And I'm reminded of, most of my work nowadays is as a stage director in opera and theatre, but I was many years ago, a festival director in Ireland asked me how a rehearsal process was going. And I said, yeah, it's going really well. And he said, you're not working hard enough. There's something about actually, if it doesn't feel impossible on some level, regardless of the context that we're working in, maybe we're not working hard enough, and maybe we're not pushing in the right directions. Thank you so much, Shaidul. It'll be great to have you with us through the conversation today. Before we move on to our next presentation, it would be great to hear a few comments from the room. If there was something that was particularly interesting or striking that came up, if there was something that you had a big argument about, if you realized that you'd solved everything, or if there's something really impossible that you need help with. If anyone, if a couple of people would like to put up your hand, and I'll come around with the microphone, if there's anything that anyone would like to share.
Great.
Yeah, Peter
Keep
Florence.
on with you.
So we've had the most amazing group here, and also the most extraordinary conversations. There's the big impossibility we found, and correct me if I get this wrong, guys, is reconciling money with independence and freedom and the ability to do anything, which sounds a lot like what Shaidul was saying about the experience in Bangladesh. And the answers we found, I think we all found, interestingly, were the same. Absolute faith in the artists pulling the money towards them, rather than us having to accommodate anybody else. And also the solidarity that asserting our own independence draws in this room, actually. The solidarity that EFA gives us to be able to say to whatever local context we have, we are a part of a huge continental or global network of people who share some of these values, but not the exact ones, but who share the principles of independence and freedom. Really, really important. I also want to share with you the best thing that I think we've all learned here, which is that in Ukraine, it turns out that festival managers and cultural managers are really good at organizing a war effort because they're so used to flexibility and adaptability, which is my big takeaway from today.
That's great to hear. Thank you, Peter, for sharing that with us. Anyone else? Anything else from your discussion that you'd like to share? Colm Croffey has something to say, I think. For once, Colm is speechless.
Tom, you're a rascal, but I love you. Yeah, we had some interesting discussions as well in our group, and one of the things that we touched upon was the inability or ability of arts organisations to reach out to the tracksuited clad amongst us and those who follow sports, because they're an audience that very often gets overlooked, that they may not have artistic or cultural leanings, but of course they do. So we had some very interesting examples of the wrestling club or wrestling activities going into the Shakespeare Theatre in Gdansk and doing a couple of evenings wrestling on the stage and bringing a different audience in there. We had from Clara Fest in 2016 where they had a boxer in the ring, but the theme was Abarmadik. Did I get that right? About mercy, yeah. And I had my little example of, I think I may have shared this with you before, the Kilkenny Arts Festival, the literature strand that Colm Tobin was producing, and he couldn't get people to go to it. Colm Tobin is a famous Irish writer, and his aunts, who were involved in the Wexford Opera Festival, got him to get the Kilkenny sports stars, these were the local sports stars, to share with the audience what they were reading between gym time and downtime as athletes. And the strand never looked back since, because people wanted to hear what their sports stars were reading and listening in their gym sessions. So there's a lot of interplay between the sports audiences and our audiences if we could just find ways to connect.
Thanks so much, Colm. It reminds me of a couple of things. It reminds me of my first visit to Colm's conference of the Association of Irish Festival Events in Ireland, where in the hotel there was an actual wrestling ring and wrestling going on, which it was something that people could book for their local festivals. And also reminds me of being in Ljubljana 10 years ago with my first experience of the Festival Academy. And a fellow participant, Julien Carrel, was running a festival at that time in Lille in France called L'Entorse, which was a festival of arts and sports where all of the projects were collaborations between artists and sports. So I think it's a really rich territory for us to be thinking about. Thank you, Colm. One final thought before we move on. Maybe something about place to set us up for the next conversation we're going to have with Eric. Thanks, Stuart.
Hi. Yeah, we talked about amateur music. Oh, there it is again. So we were talking about amateur musicians and plays. So we had this really beautiful example last year in our Arcadia Festival where we have a very strong fanfare culture. Yeah. So we have this fanfare near the sea, which is a World Heritage Sea, and there is this girl in the fanfare, and also her father and her son are performing at the fanfare. And they have a place near the sea they're all in love with, because a lot of love stories start at that sea. So it's sort of said we really want to, do a piece of music there, but fanfare music in the Netherlands is really very much more like sports than it is like arts. It's competition, and you act in competition and you play as precise as you can. You don't improvise. So they wanted to do a piece at that place that they're in love with, and they invited a composer who wrote a piece for contemporary music, which is completely something different. And he wrote a drone composition, so they had to improvise at the sea. So it was on location, and the sea needs protection as well, so this is a very important part. They played a drone composition where 50% was improvisation of drones, and 50% was the sound of the birds, the sound of the wind, the sound of the sea, and it was such an emotional thing. It was beautiful. And this relationship of place and people, to put that on the stage through the arts, that was probably one of the highlights of our festival this year. It was beautiful.
Fantastic. So I can speak over this. You can leave the music playing; it's very nice. So we're going to move on then to the next part of this morning. We'd invite you to stay in the groups that you're in, so that the first conversation that you've had can, if everyone takes a deep breath, relax. To stay in the groups that you're in, so that your first conversations can inform the next conversation. But I'd like to introduce our second guest speaker for today, which is Eric Horine, cultural philosopher, social scientist, professor of urban studies at the Vrije Universiteit in Brussels, the founder of Cosmopolis, a Centre for Urban Research, the co-founder of the Brussels Studies Institute, director of the Brussels Academy, and among other things, and co-chair of Brussels 2030, which I think is particularly relevant for us today, which is the bid to become cultural capital of Europe in 2030. To speak about the urban and festivals and their place in it, I'd invite Dr. Eric Horine. Thanks.
Hello, everybody. Let me first start with thanking the organizers for the invitation. We tried it 2 years ago and didn't work out then. And I'm really happy to be with you here because to share not only, let's say, a subject that I'm passionate about for the last 30 years, but I also like in a priority to share with artists and cultural organizers, because I do think that one of the main challenges in the world today is changing narratives. And as a researcher, in fact, I'm going to share with you an argument under the title, "A City is Not a Country." And as I have to be short, I have to be radical. I am basically much more nuanciated in that, and we can talk about it, but if you have a quarter of an hour, you have to be clear in the ideas. I started to be interested in urbanity, which is much more than the city. It's the urban culture, in fact, 30 years ago, related to globalization, and starting to look at a very obvious fact that is, for me, underestimated and not taken into consideration in cultural philosophy in general. And that is that globalization is urbanization. In the beginning of the 20th century, only 10% of the world population lived in cities. In the beginning of this century, more than half of it. And in the most developed continents, it's 3/4 of the population. So the human species has become an urban species, and I do think that we don't know it yet, and that we do behave as a suburban or a rural species. And that transition is for me very important. I think that that transition is as important as the Neolithical revolution and the Industrial revolution at the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century. The cities I'm speaking of are bigger also. In 1900, there were only 11 cities of 1 million inhabitants. Today, that is nearly 600 or up to 650 cities, and in 2030, it will be 750 cities of 1 million, of which 150 in China. So, urbanization and their surroundings, the metropolis, is in fact the territory, the area we have to work with. In Europe, there is some specific elements to it, because we have a much longer history of urbanization, and that means that the cities are on average smaller than in other continents. We have about 70 metropolitan areas of more than 1 million inhabitants. Most of the cities are smaller cities. But more than half of the population of Europe is living in these city centers. And these city centers make innovation, make the post-industrial society, and install an agenda that is totally different than the traditional agendas we are working with. One element is, in my argument, that we have to rethink radically the composition of European. And if ever we want to think Europeanness, we will have to change, I think we have to shift from the construction of Europe as it is. If you look at the European population density, you see that Europeans are not spread evenly over the space, and that are concentrated in a central area. You can see that from the air also. You basically see the post-medieval urbanization starting points in the Low Countries and in northern Italy, and related with the Rhine cities. You see the metropolitan areas and their connectivity. You see, in fact, from the air, what it has been called the blue banana, that central European area. In fact, Europe is functioning in a center-periphery model where 19% of the territory contains more than 60% of the population and 3/4 of the GDP. So, in fact, that is what determining the EU dynamics, productivity rates, standards of living, etc. And also in connectivity with the rest of the world, you see that blue banana, that central area arising, which of course gives the pressure to cities like Yerevan or other cities to invest a lot in their capital cities, what most countries now do, to keep up with that global networking, that space of flows that is being organized around cities. Because the reality of a single market, the reality of globalization is in fact connecting cities. The space of flows is gradually replacing the space of places. And how do we express that culturally? In that way. You see, the big country, France, with their French flag, and then the most populated country, Germany, with the German flag, that's the country of the Germans. And then, of course, in that mental mapping, the 3 million Turks living in Germany, what are they doing there? They have their own territory with their own flag. The 19th century construction of Europe is still dominating the way we tell cultural stories, the way we tell the place we are on. And in reality, it is functioning in that way. A center-periphery tension in a networked continent. And that's the kind of way of perspective I am proposing to look at, towards a world of networked cities. What if the European Union would not be a club of nation states, but would be a club of metropolitan areas? What if? Let us at least, as an intellectual experiment, think that kind of connectivity and building Europeanness on that basis. And it's on the basis of these very obvious empirical data, in fact, that I think that we have to recenter culture, rethink the arts, culture, intellectual activities. A city is not a country. A city is not a society that is based on commonality, on a certain form of identity. A city is living together on the basis of difference. Super diversity is really the concept we are working at the moment, which is even more than multicultural, multi-communitarian societies, but within the communities you have an increased diversity that is being installed. Knowing that somebody is part of a community doesn't give you an insight in the way of life, in how the things are organized. And I think that the world is basically being rescaled from nation state to multicultural, looking at Europe as a metropolitan network. Again, I say I have to be radical. This is a way of looking and is not eliminating the other way of looking or the other realities. It's installing a tension, a dialectics, an opposition even. And today in Europe, there is a rising of nationalism again. There is a rise again of imposing one national culture in some countries. And I think urbanity is in fact in tension with that movement, as we see states where authoritarian cultural narratives are being imposed centrally, mostly cities and local entities are opposing that. That's the case in Poland, that's the case in Hungary, that's the case in Turkey, where the bigger cities are not led in the same kind of narrative, in the same kind of ideology. And so there is a lot of our ideas about culture. Language is not automatically culture. We are speaking English with each other, and we cannot suppose that everybody is an expert in Shakespeare because of that common language. Lingua francas lose their cultural references or part of their cultural references. Culture is not automatically a way of life. So we have to look at social practices as the real behavior of people and not stereotyping them as is done in most of the approaches. And society is not community. We are coming from a history of sociology where we think that community, Gemeinschaft, is the basis of society, Gesellschaft. And I think these two in an urban context are being dissociated. In fact, we have different communities in cities that have to make one society. And we don't have the theory, we don't have the way, in fact, to realize that. And global systemic challenges are urban agendas. I don't have the time to dwell in, but I have a lot of empirical data. The pandemic, basically, the actual energy crisis. I mean, they're global challenges governed by nation states, but in fact, where the reality of it is an urban question. And these challenges are basically our relationship with nature, the social inequality agenda, and then culture, how to live together in a multicultural environment. All cities have, in one or the other way, these kind of challenges. And so I think to oppose national culture is based on the idea of a common history. It's the common history over the generations that produces a tradition, that produces an identity, a certain repertoire. And the basis of the nation state is in fact representation, representative democracy, and also representative culture. That is representing, let's say, that kind of imagined unity. And all that is contained in a clear territory. France stops at the border with Italy, and there Italy starts. This kind of territorial organization of commonality within the borders and difference outside the borders. This is not what the urban culture represents. If we in Brussels, we should look at the common roots and the common history of people to tell the story of social cohesion, we are blocked before we start. 2/3 of our population comes from elsewhere, is arriving. We are an arriving city. And most of the cities are becoming more and more arrival cities. And so it's not the history, it's the common destiny, it's the project. And so whereas the unity of a state comes from the past, I think the unity of a city comes from the future. And you will say, yes, but the future doesn't exist. Well, the past doesn't exist either. It's also a narrative. It's also a construction. And so I think the cultural challenge is to construct, to build that culture, that common future. That is not an identity. That is not a clear-cut identity. It's hybrid. It's interdependent with all the kind of interactions. And so it's much more unstable than the national identity or the national culture. And that's why representation, both in representative democracy as in a cultural repertoire, are not working in cities. And that only participation of the population, consultation, and even co-production in the narrative is necessary to see whether the construction of that common destiny is working. And it is much more functioning in a networked format than it is working in a territorial format. And in that sense, the two paradigms are really excluding each other. Again, I say I have to radicalize my discourse. It's a dialectic. There is in reality, there's always a mixture of the two, but the two have different logics and different approaches. And in that approach, you have three significant references. You have community, not one community in a city, different communities, group formations around bonding. But society is about bridging. It's not about, let's say, assimilating people to one kind of community, but to constructing the intercultural, the intercommunitarian bridging, in fact. And that's the challenge to become a citizen. The urban republic, the polis, la cité, citizenship is basically people that are belonging to a community, but accepting that their community cannot form the whole, and so becoming a citizen of something that is intercommunitarian, intercultural. And that's why the creative city, arts and culture, research are so central in developing that common destination. And that's what we're going to try, but I don't have the time to explain you. Going to try is to put in the bit of Brussels 2030 is to make arts and culture central in the urban project, not in a national project as it exists today in the Flemish or the French-speaking communities, but in the construction of a kind of Brusselitude that could then resonate with a kind of Europeanness that is also transnational. And that is why I think that the narrative for city making gives us an agenda that I want to share with you. A city is not a country. It is a whole world. And that's why I'm defending urbanity as a political project, as nationality was that project of the 19th century. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Eric, for these very strong, timely, provocative ideas, I think. And I find myself thinking about, if we're thinking about the world or the EU as a networked cities of metropolitan areas, we might also think of it as a network of festivals or a group of networked festivals. And I think also to think about this idea of urbanity as a super diversity and multicultural, and to think about how we might apply that to the worlds that we make in our festivals. I'd love to ask you just about how, what you think the implications of this philosophy are for festivals, how do festivals fit into this idea of urbanity, and how might festivals take on this idea of urbanity in the way they operate?
Well, I think, in my view, if you ask me, research-wise, or at the level of empirical data, a festival is not a festival. We have to make a distinction between the aims, the organization, the history of festivals. Some festivals are oriented to a kind or to a part of representative culture, and are in fact reproducing a certain repertoire, adapting it to new conditions, but basically based on that. Other festivals are purely creative and oriented to the new, the non-existing, or the not yet existing. And in that sense, I'm very interested just in those elements in arts and culture where we don't have the answer yet. We don't have the answer how to make a multilingual theater play. In Brussels, we already subtitle our plays, but distorting in a certain way, or getting away from language as a cultural unity. How a multilingual play would work, for instance. How we see in Brussels exactly that making music, new music, it's not just putting together different instruments, you have to recreate music. It is not possible to just combine parts of our music history and then say that is the new. And so the creative aspect of solving the problem with multicultural, the problem with difference, not only making festivities of it, but living together on the basis of difference is a difficult thing. That is what urbanity is about. And I think artists and festivals should, or some of them at least, should take up the challenge of, let's say, proposing narratives and stories and new kinds of references. And I don't know what the relationship with tradition is. That is, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, you could say. But that is very much, we discussed in our group the place-related aspects. Well, most of the festivals look at places as venues and then install their program in that venue. I would argue to look at the social geography of a city and to see whether the venue is not just a place, it's also an environment of people living there the whole year or the whole time. And so the negotiation with that environment and their cultural references is vital, I think, for having the authorization of using their place for the time of a festival. And that's a totally different procedure of programming a festival, for instance. So that relationship to urbanity in its social geography and in its localized difference is something I think we should, well, I'm ready to coach you, but more research is needed before you make a program.
I think what you say also has kind of implications for the way an organization like this, of all of these different festivals, kind of exist and network in relation to each other. And I think this shift you spoke about, moving from a space of places to a space of flows, and how sort of the space that something like EFA and this network and this alliance might occupy flows as much, if not or more than we occupy places.
Yeah. Well, I think that, of course, cities, if you analyze them in their diversity, super diversity and multiculturality differ. I mean, not all cities in Europe are like Brussels, with 2/3 of the population coming from elsewhere, and with a nation state that is dividing in two types of communities. In Brussels, we have two types of cultural centers, Flemish one, a French-speaking one, two types of school system, etc. That's a very unique situation, but that's why it's a living lab for people like me, in fact, to observe what happens. And I think one of the things festivals can do is to prepare cities that are much more, let's say, unitarian at this moment and relate to the nation state or the national culture in a much more easy way, to prepare them or to, let's say, install the tension by co-production, collaboration, visiting events, to learn them to live on the basis of difference. I mean, with all my respect, and I really love that, but an evening like yesterday, we could not produce such an evening in Brussels anymore. Presenting the city with elements of, let's say, national culture and constructed national culture, because historically it's not the same territory, in fact, and making us relate to that, to present Yerevan, and maybe this works. I don't have any opinion yet, but it is impossible for us in Brussels to present such an evening. If you come to Brussels, we cannot represent Brussels in such a way. The only way to represent it is to invite Metex, which is an artistic project to combine Mediterranean or Moroccan music with, you could say, Flemish fanfares, to speak simply, and to combine it and to recompose music at that basis, with that composition that is not made. Stromae, Arno, those people could not have produced what they produced without Brussels, because you can experiment around the corner, the other culture, the other cultural expression. And I think that kind of distanciation of the national tradition is going to happen in the next 30 years, 40 years, in all of the bigger cities. In all of the bigger cities. And they are not going to be able, a city like Berlin already cannot be only told as the capital of Germany with the great or the less great German history. So we have to express urbanity in a certain way.
Thank you so much. This idea of a festival as a laboratory for how we live together in the future, I find this very kind of strong and important, and also terrifying in a way, in that it potentially puts a lot of responsibility on the people here in the room to play a role in how we are going to live together. So let's talk about that. It would be great to hear one or two comments from your conversations. Is there anything that anyone would like to share with us? Anything that came up which was surprising or infuriating or frightening or exhilarating? Carlos from Krakow.
Actually, I'm not speaking only for my group. I'm gonna go a little bit controversial regarding Professor Eric's presentation, and I'm speaking a little bit from the point of view of a Brazilian. I hope Robert doesn't kill me for that. My question is just a question for all of you. Professor Eric made a very interesting point about the multiculturalism and the question in Brussels. And I come from São Paulo, where I have to say the highest amount of Japanese people outside Japan is in São Paulo. The highest amount of Italians, actually we eat more pizza in São Paulo than in Italy. And we're all proud Paulistas, as we will say. We're all proud from being in São Paulo. We don't have this, we had in the past, we don't have this, okay, you're Italian, okay, you're Japanese, or okay, you're Syrian or Lebanese in São Paulo. My question is, how much European organizers can talk to us and actually learn from other countries, from Brazil, from Mexico, from Bangladesh, things that happened in our tough history, and now it's happening in Europe. How much European policymakers as well are willing to learn from us? And actually, I'm not saying São Paulo is the most perfect city, it's one of them, but we like, for example, we have this done right. We were very welcoming toward foreigners. On the other hand, in São Paulo, it's very unfortunate that we have xenophobism towards people from the north and the northwest part of Brazil, which is our own country. Here we can learn more from you. I don't think there is this healthy competition between São Paulo and Rio. But there's some hatred towards the north. I don't think there's hatred between Hamburg and Munich. I don't think we have between Krakow and Warsaw, but it's not hatred. So that's my question. How can, for example, Professor Eric also mentioned the event yesterday, and that it wouldn't be able to give such a feeling of an event in Brussels. How much a city, municipality of Brussels representative of someone organizing can invite someone from Yerevan and say, guys, teach us how you do such an event which is truly Yerevanian. And that's my question for all of you. Like, I'm speaking a little bit from the outside. We're always willing to learn something from Europe, and the amount of things that I learned today are very, like, priceless. And I want that, like, we are like Brazilians, Mexicans, Ecuadorians, whatever, Bangladesh, Indians, we are also experts in something. And how much are you willing to invite us to take part and help Europe with your own problems? So that's pretty much it. And yeah, enjoy your lunch.
Thank you so much, Carlos. And I guess it's worth being reminded that our festivals are laboratories for these kinds of exchanges to happen. So I think, yeah, absolutely more of this. I think there's a point here, and then a point over here, and then we'll move on.
Yes, thank you. We had in this group first a conversation what a rural festival is. Is that a festival which happens out in the country, or is it linked to the content of the festival? So first we concluded that it's a festival regardless of the content which happens outside of big cities and centers. So obviously we have here Natalia, who runs exactly that kind of festival, which is visited by 120,000 people and happens in 3 villages. And the program is very international, very urban, if you want so. So there is another issue which is related to the behavior of tourists under influence of the pandemics and corona. So people tend to travel more to open spaces rather than doing city jumps like before, visiting Barcelona or Amsterdam or Dublin. They go to national parks and so. And that's of course an opportunity for festivals which happen out on open spaces, remote of some big centers. So it can also be taken into consideration.
Yeah, thank you so much. Final comment over here.
So I go there. Okay. We thought a little about the very good provocation the speaker did, and also about the concept of the blue banana. And I think the main of the festivals are not in that designed, pictured symbol. And I think that the main of the cultural activities are in the blue banana. So maybe the most of the cultural activities involved in the metropolitan area are not festivals. But we have to accept the challenge, because in some way many festivals are already ready, and already they did programs, very different programs. Many festivals present classical music, but also special cultural events involving immigrants, involving the civil society. So maybe we were a little worried, because we are a small town festival, so we have to do some lobby work, because sometimes we have to face this challenge and face also the political decision that we are going to have next years.
Thank you, Franco, so much. I don't know if there's a comment from the online discussion.
No, it finished. They were early.
The online discussion have finished. They've figured it all out. Or maybe they went and had their lunch where they are.
They have lunch.
Thank you so much. We will shortly have lunch, and then after lunch we will come back, and there will be two more keynotes and 2 more discussions. We will hear from Danica Brug, who is a professor of management from Slovenia who runs a business school as an art gallery. And we will hear from Dominika Lasota, who is a climate justice activist from Poland. And then we will have a chance to discuss how to put those provocations into practice in our own contexts. But before that, I'll hand over to Catherine.
Cool. Thanks, Tom. And congratulations to all of you. You did a great job until now. Applause to yourself.